All right, here we are with John Thorne. John, thanks so much. Good to see you.
Good seeing you. Glad to be
Yeah,
here.
yeah, it's a real pleasure. So I wanted to just start off with some recent news. It's 30th anniversary of Wrapped in Plastic's launch, I believe, and I personally own no copies. I think have all your books, and I'm a big fan of your writing. So do you think I should purchase some Wrapped in Plastic copies, or do I kind of have it covered?
Well, I thank you for the compliment, and thank you for buying the books. Yeah, Wrapped in Plastic, we did 75 issues and, ran for 13 years from 92 to 2005. I tried to, when I made my first book, which is essentially the, compilation of all the important Twin Peaks material from those issues. Lots of material, of course, is not in the book. So, if we did an interview with like Miguel Ferrer, for example, I only used the interview material that had to do with Twin Peaks. We talked to him about a lot of different things, and just same as true with so many of the actors. So just for the interviews, and there's interviews with people who weren't in Twin Peaks. There's that, and there's lots of articles that are in Wrapped in Plastic that were contributed by other writers, and stuff that we did about Mark Frost's work, David Lynch's work. So there's a lot of material in those issues. I don't know how easy they are to track down. Some of them are harder to get now. So eBay, I guess, is your best shot. You might find, I could recommend, some issues versus others are worth getting.
Yeah, maybe later I'll ask you for certain issues, but
sure.
At the rate I'm going, I only started watching Twin Peaks in 2020, so I'm very, very late to the party. But at the rate I'm going, I'll probably snatch up everything I can get. But I think tonight mostly we're going to be talking about the return with the focus on your newest book, and I've told you on a couple of occasions I'm a big admirer of that book. I think it's a huge accomplishment. It's such a massive show. You said it was going to take you a year. Apparently it took you 4. So what's up with that?
Yeah, I didn't know what how long it would take. I knew I had to write about it. I knew I wouldn't be done. Well, I'm not going to be done, but I knew that if I didn't address it, if I didn't write about it, that there would be this big gap in my relationship with Twin Peaks over the decades. And so I felt compelled to write about it. And I wasn't quite sure. I was pretty scared, to be honest with you. I wasn't quite sure at the beginning what I could do, if I could make sense of any of it. Some of it was pretty baffling. And then I thought, well, I'll just write my way through it. I kind of talk about this a little bit in the book. I'll just sort of comment on it, and it'll be like an audio commentary on a DVD. And that wasn't sufficient. I knew I needed to do more. And so as I wrote, I realized I needed to do more. And what started is, I thought it would take a year, took close to 4 years to do. And so the result is my book. Yeah. Hopefully, people will find some value in it.
Yeah, I'm hoping to get into a little bit of the content of the book, but probably even more so, a little bit about your approach. I teach middle school and high school students, middle school full-time and high school as a tutor. And one of the main things that they're developing at this point in their career is their analytical skills. So It's interesting. I'm not sure if you think back to 8th grade or so where you were analytically, but it's interesting really to track somebody who's successfully tackled this material, because this material is really difficult. And I noticed that there are some things that you brought to your analysis that I had never heard of, and I think a lot of readers or a lot of watchers of the show never heard of, and they allowed you to maybe unlock certain perspectives. So on the one hand, I'm glad that you, I guess, shared those lenses with us through your book. And on the other hand, if you don't mind, I just want to start with just some basic analysis type questions.
Sure. Yeah.
And starting with, could you have done this say, did you have the skill set to do this 25 years ago to tackle the return?
25 years ago, might have been able to do it. And I say that only because Twin Peaks, the original show, sort of propelled me into my graduate work. Okay. I went back to graduate school after Twin Peaks had aired because I was interested in television and I was interested in television production. And it was during that course of study that I became interested in what's called narrative theory. I did my thesis on the television series Homicide, which was on a long, long time ago, which was one of my favorite shows at the time. And I deliberately chose that because I was too close to Twin Peaks. I wanted something that I could step back from a little bit and take a little more objectively. But anyway, I studied what's called narrative theory, and narrative theory is basically the study of how we tell stories, what a story is and how we present a story to someone, whether it's in text as a book, which is where narrative theory kind of grew out of. But there's been a lot of study of narrative theory in film and television because there's obviously sound and visual elements there. And because when you're telling a story on film and television, unlike a book, it's running at its own rate. And so you really don't have necessarily the luxury of stopping it, certainly when you're watching a movie in a theater. And going back and watching a scene, you can do that now at home video. But anyway, so it's a long answer to your question. I started studying narrative theory in the late 90s and early 2000s. So I think that's when, honestly, I started to feel confident in my writing about Twin Peaks. And it was then, in those years, that I started writing what I think are my better essays about the original show and about Fire Walk with Me. So I guess, it's kind of a silly answer to your question. There was certainly a time I could not have done it, but
yeah. But it sounds like you had a lot of raw material as a fan and as a pretty passionate fan of the show. And then you acquired maybe, I guess you rounded out or added on to your formal skill set through your graduate work, and then returned to Twin Peaks, I guess, maybe a little more armed. Would you say that's accurate?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I like to read good, informative essays about film and television. And one of the things we tried to do in Wrapped in Plastic was, because I like an academic essay, but what I don't like is an academic essay that makes me really work hard to read it, where it's using, terminology that most people don't understand. It's assuming all this theory that you probably never heard of before. Mm-hmm. And so what we tried to do in the magazine was to write essentially academic essays. These are informed research works, but written in a way that are somewhat readable, that you can kind of read it and you're carried along by what, by what the theory is, but also about also what the content, what the topic is. And that's what we tried to do in the magazine. That's what I try to do when I write even, now, is make it accessible. Because there's some fascinating, that's fascinating theory there, and you can make it really hard to understand, and or you can try to work it, making it easier to understand. And so that's been certainly my effort, is to try to provide well-researched, grounded theoretical approaches to something, but also make it kind of interesting, lively, readable. I don't know if I've succeeded at that, but that's definitely been my goal.
Yeah, that's great. And there are people who do like reading that stuff for fun, and do like reading those types of essays for fun. Not for school, not for grades, for speculation. And I think Twin Peaks fans probably skew a little heavily in that direction. It kind of draws that kind of crowd. And I will say that I love the book, and I've read different sections of it, but it's a lot, it's dense. The show is dense. There's a lot of concepts that I think you succeeded at not making too academic and yet just the material itself is a little bit abstract, including some of the concepts. So I hope to get into that in a little bit. But
Sure.
Just broadly, how's the reception been for the new book?
Pretty good, and I will say maybe a little better than I expected. And I guess maybe I was a bit, when you're writing it, and I've said this before in other interviews, you're by yourself with it, and you don't know what other people are going to think. And I could perceive people wanting to throw the book across the room, because some of the ideas I put forth, I have certain theories that I propose that I think are supported by the text, and they may not be what other people, and this has happened to me before in other essays, what people want to hear, or what they felt about the work. I try to keep that in mind when I'm writing, because I do think it's important to honor all people's opinions and not try to force an idea on someone. What I want to do is try to guide someone through an idea and say, look, here's a way of looking at it, certainly with the support of theory and research and the text itself. So the response has been, there's been some good reviews. I've read, a few on Amazon, and then people have tweeted out very nice things. And it's very, it really is gratifying. It really makes me feel good that I've reached some people. That's what I like about a book about one of my favorite films or whatever. It's just like, oh, we're kind of sharing the work again. We're sharing it, what we liked about it, and opening a few doors, maybe getting some new ideas out there. So again, a long answer.
Yeah, well, I made like a kind of half-hearted attempt to maybe even start like a little discussion group, and then I'm like, well, that's not happening. Let me just try to talk to John himself. So I figured that might be better. I have a question I've been wanting to ask you. Have you did you learn anything about yourself, or did you develop in any way through the course of working on this book?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, without a doubt. I think, this really gets into the material. Writing about the character of Dale Cooper, whom I think in The Return is far more present than might be obvious, and I think is being presented to us in this new Twin Peaks as someone who is struggling, who is flawed, who is trying to overcome some self-imposed barriers. All of that made me think about myself and about how you perceive the world, and what is important to you, and what is driving you, and what is getting in the way of success, however you want to define that. And so yeah, I obviously I get into a little bit of the Hindu philosophy, which was new to me, and I found some very appealing material there. I know very little about it, but some of the Hindu approach to living your life I thought made some sense, and I've tried to kind of see the world and accept the world a little differently now than perhaps before I wrote the book. And that's all because of my research and what I think David Lynch is trying to convey to us in the Return. So yes, I think I'm a little different.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you for that. I'm hoping to just transition a little bit into some of your methodology or some of your methods, and if you want to, answer certain things or not, that's okay. But I'll start light. You've said this a number of times, and maybe even in the book. Reading or writing your way toward the truth is an expression you like to use, and so what does that mean to you?
Well, it's interesting to me is that sometimes I have an idea about a concept or an idea in Twin Peaks, or I don't, and I sit down and I write about it, and I kind of let my thoughts flow, and I think about. I try to be as honest as I can with the work too. I don't want to force it to go in any particular direction, and And it has often happened that while I'm writing, I will make a discovery. It will happen in the moment while the pen is passing across the page. For example, I can give you an example.
Yeah.
And that is when I was writing I think I call it I'm a Lonely Soul, or a Lonely Soul essay. And it was the essay about Cooper's soul trapped in the Red Room. And I was writing about Cooper, and I was writing about him, his soul, and I just remembered the one-armed man saying, "When I saw the face of God, I was changed," and the idea that Dougie might be an angelic figure. All of those ideas, I didn't think about them when I started the essay. If that makes any sense. Those things sort of coalesce as you're going, and then you realize, oh, this maybe is the core of what I wanted to write about. Then you go back and you start reworking, to kind of make it a more smoother essay. Yeah. But those ideas sometimes don't come until you're literally in that moment of just putting words down, letting the words come out when you're writing. Not that they just come out all the time, too. Sure. I mean, there's a lot of times where I'm pulling my hair and I can't get to something. You have to walk away from it. But that's what I mean when I'm writing, and a lot of times too, I will say, I write myself to a dead end. I will write and there's nothing there, and you can't be afraid to do that, because you are going to throw a lot of stuff away, but you also know now what not to focus on, which there is value to writing a bunch of stuff that you throw away. So again, it's just, I guess maybe some people say, well, you need to sit down and outline and figure it all out. And I get that. But for me, it's more write and see kind of where it's going to go.
Is there anything you do to stay disciplined? To discipline yourself, or to discipline your arguments or your analysis? Or is it just it shows you it's dead end when it gets there? Like, is there anything you do to try to avoid illusions or delusions or anything like that, especially when the energy is high?
Well, I guess when it comes to discipline, I mean, if you're feeling the writing, then try to keep going. Don't stop. If your life allows for that, it doesn't always. There are lots of things in life that get in the way. One thing I would recommend to writers is don't write. Well, for me, it's all different. Everyone's different. If I'm writing late at night, then I can't get to sleep. I can't relax. I found that I would cut myself off at 9 p.m. I would kind of force myself to stop, even if things were going pretty well. What I would do if things were going pretty well is I start making notes. I start bulleting, go here, go here, go here, go here, go here, and then stop, and then go watch some TV, and then read for a while. Because if I would write till like 11:30 or midnight, which I would do sometimes, then I'd go to bed. Well, forget it. I'm up till 2 or 3, just laying in bed. Yeah. And that's not good. I mean, these are kind of nitty-gritty answers to your question. That's great,
because sometimes when you're going and watching TV or having a snack or even reading something else in the background, sometimes your thoughts are sort of coalescing or dancing around or doing something. Rather than keeping you awake.
I mean, one thing I did try to do in those instances, like I said, is you don't want to stop when you're right on the verge of something either. So obviously, it's if I can go another half an hour to make sure I got this point down, but then when you kind of have it, kind of know where you're going to go, you can then stop. And some people it might be different. They might be better at night. Who knows? But I'm not sure that answered all of your question. But
yeah, that's great. But I'm going to have to twiddle my fingers for the next question. So
okay, all right.
Feel thinking. The concept of feel thinking, which is a phrase we all know. What does that mean to you? Is that a part of your approach at all?
Yeah, well, of course, that comes from David Lynch, where he talks about, I think it was specifically from an interview where he was talking about Mulholland Drive, where he said, a lot of it, fits together and makes sense, but some of it you have to kind of think. And I think, well, it's difficult with Lynch on assigning what that means, but, Lynch believes in intuition and believes in the idea that it makes, you'll know if it makes sense. And so I think that applies to some of when I'm writing, the idea that and that kind of fits with what I was saying before, is that you're writing, you're letting it flow out of you. So you're feeling it, and then you'll know maybe a little bit after the fact, you start to think about, this isn't making sense. So you got to be open to being able to sort of let it flow, feel it, and then you kind of just know if it's going in the right direction or not. So an example would be one that did not work for me was writing about Gordon Cole, and Gordon Cole talking about the whole backstory of Cooper and Cooper's plan that he put together with Major Briggs. Now, part of this is due to the fact that I think that Mark Frost and David Lynch were working somewhat at odds here when Lynch finally came to filming The Return. I wrote a lot of that, tried to figure out what the backstory was, and I had an idea. I thought, I think I know. And the more I wrote, the less it made sense. And so, but I had to do that. I had to write it out. And then I was in a quandary, because I'm like, what am I going to do here? I could include all that in the book and just say it doesn't make sense. Or I could not include it in the book and say, if you think about this really hard, it doesn't make sense, and not go into too much, overwhelmed with too much data. And that's what I ended up doing ultimately. Yeah. But so I, again, it's kind of, you gotta feel think is such a funny term. Yeah. You gotta kind of open yourself to the text and see how the text is working for you. And I think if it's a successful text, that is, the writer and the director really do have a grasp of their material, then I think if you open yourself to it, you will also feel that it works for you, makes some intuitive sense to you. And so that's the feeling part of it. And then just trying to encapsulate that in words is the thinking part. Yeah. I hope that makes sense.
No, thanks. Yeah, that's actually a good answer, and a little bit helpful as well. So for something else I've been thinking about, and it's hard to make that happen in like a middle school classroom. So I'm gonna say, like, middle school essay prompts or analysis prompts are often they're often rather structured. They'll be like something like analyze the theme and maybe like 3 techniques the author uses in conjunction to develop the theme. High school, you might get something like, here are 3 different lenses, apply one of these lenses to X text. And then, college, grad school, etc. Sometimes there's nothing at all. It's like kind of start from scratch. Here's your text, do something with it. And I imagine your approach with your book and To the Return, it was starting from scratch. Here's the text, do something with it. Is that kind of true? Like, how do you grapple with something that huge?
Well, okay, I did have some experience with Twin Peaks for a while. Yeah. I mean, I'd written about Twin Peaks so much and had interviewed so many of the actors, and David Lynch and Mark Frost and Harley Peyton and Robert Engels. I immersed myself, and I watched so much Lynch work, so I kind of immersed myself in it. I kind of felt I knew how Lynch approached the work, what was important to him, and so those things were already there. And I, even before The Return started, I was thinking about it, like, what's David Lynch going to do with this? And I was pretty certain, honestly, that it was going to be an internal story. It was going to be a story about someone struggling with themselves, because that's really most of what Lynch's work is.
Okay.
So I feel like I had maybe, I was a few steps ahead, at least in terms of, if somebody came in brand new and they didn't know Lynch's work, that's a pretty tough place to be. So I had decades of that. And
and I'm sorry to interrupt you. Was that a crutch at all, or was that like a potential block, having so much background knowledge? I mean, obviously you need the background knowledge, but like having hunches, predictions, did any of that stuff?
Well, okay, yeah, that's a good question, because one thing, even though I had hunches and predictions, I remember talking to this on many interviewers before the show came on, was I tried to clear my mind and expect just about anything to happen in Twin Peaks: The Return. That it could very well be that they were just going to tell the story again. It was going to start all over again with the murder of Laura Palmer. That's just an example.
Yeah.
I tried to be as open as I could to it, with the very general idea that, knowing Lynch, it would probably somehow, well, two things I expected, I guess. It would be about an internal, ultimately about someone at odds with themselves. And that at some point in the story, it was going to flip. It was going to be very confusing. That we were going to be like, okay, Scott Ryan and I called it the Mulholland Drive moment. I don't know if you're familiar with Mulholland Drive. You watch 2 hours of the movie. It looks like it's pretty straightforward. Yeah. And then something flips and everything's inverted, and you ultimately have to reassess the first 2 hours. I thought there would be that. And there was, except it happened in hour 18 of 17 plus hours into an 18-hour story. So that was a little surprising, more than a little surprising.
Yeah. I'm going to zoom out just a tad.
Sure.
This is kind of more coming from a teacher perspective, because whenever I could steal little snippets, I try to. I mean, even from people who are working at a high level, is there what is challenging about analysis to you? Analyzing Twin Peaks, and maybe analyzing Twin Peaks: The Return in particular, what just jumps out as just challenging? Wow. I guess you could take any of those three questions would be fine.
Well, I think the biggest challenging thing about Twin Peaks, I'm going to have to get specific here. I don't know if I can answer it generally. A lot of people struggle with all of Lynch's work, this idea of it's all a dream. It's a dream. It's all inside the mind of someone. And there is some examples of that, I think, in Lynch's work, where it was probably a dream, or parts of it were a dream. And so you find some analysts fall back on that somewhat as the explanation for some of the crazy, odd, bizarre things. And I felt that while I have written about dream theories before and feel strongly about them in other contexts, I felt like the struggle here was, how do I look at this work and not dismiss it as a dream, because I felt like there was a value to these other characters, this other story. The story, there's value to the story of the log lady and that she dies. If that is not quote unquote real within the story, then it seems to lose some value to me. But there's all this other stuff that's going on that's very hard to reconcile without it being just sort of randomness. And so when I'm getting very specific here, when I found some of the Hindu information and the Hindu teachings and learned a little bit more about that helped me come up with an idea that I thought helped explain some of the very confusing elements of The Return. That's a very specific answer. In a more general, I guess, way, it was a very long story. It was 18 hours long, and certainly on the first few exposures to it, it was really hard to get my hands around something that long, to keep in mind things that were happening in parts 15 and 16 when I'm watching parts 2 and 3.
Yeah.
And so one thing that happened that I didn't expect was that I saw a structure to the story, which was this 3-act structure. And once I saw that, for me, then I could get my hands around it a lot. I thought, okay, I've got an act here, and I can look at that kind of by itself. And I've got an act here. So I started breaking it down.
Get a little manageable. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's true of a long book, of a long, really, it doesn't have to be long. It can be a short movie. If there's a lot of going on in it, if you can start breaking it down and seeing how the pieces fit together, what leads to what, then you get a little more comfortable with the work. So that was a challenge for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'd like to get into some of those, a couple different frameworks that at least I assume were kind of at the heart of your book, in addition to your own, to your own sort of independent thinking. So first of all, would you agree that Seymour Chapman and his work with covert narrators, and Brian Rourke and his kind of concept of the fractured narrator or protagonist, and then some of the Vedas, like, would you say those were your 3 primary sort of frameworks or lenses or tools that you brought to bear on the return, or maybe not?
Well, yes. I mean, the Chapman stuff was stuff that I had studied years and years ago. And so whenever I watch anything, I kind of try to look at it in terms of how, not to get too, again, not too detailed, but.
No, please do.
So a story, I shouldn't say a story, a film or a book or a television series, what's happening is there's 2 things that go on. There's a story and there's discourse. A story is just what happened. Bob went out to pick up some groceries, and along the way, he found this $1 million in a bush, and then he was attacked by, some criminals who chased him, and however it ends, it ends. That's the story. The discourse is how you tell that story. You could tell that story from Bob's point of view. You can tell that story from the guys who were chasing him's point of view. You can tell it in flashbacks. You can, you can tell it with a narrator. You could tell it Bob's narrating it, or there's an omniscient, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's the discourse. And the discourse is a way of telling a story. And I find that fascinating. How do we tell a story? How do we involve the viewer in what we're telling? Because I could tell you a story that sounds extremely boring, but I could show it to you in a way that you can't stop watching it. And that's fascinating to me. And that's what the Seymour Chapman book is all about. And he basically is analyzing books and written work. But again, there's a lot to do with film. The Brian Rourke stuff, which is about Inland Empire, which was the film.
Can I just stop you just for a second? And I'm sorry for that.
No.
Can you just get into a little bit the distinction, unless you want to wait, the distinction between Chapman's covert narrator versus like an omniscient narrator? Because they seem to have maybe more in common than they don't have in common, but there's definitely a difference.
Yeah, and again, I will say that I'm not a total expert on this. So I think an omniscient narrator is a narrator that is somewhat reliable and is just sort of telling the story from a remove. A covert narrator is probably a little more involved in the story, is someone or potentially a character in the story, but hidden. And so you don't necessarily realize that the story you're hearing is being told from a biased point of view. The omniscient narrator may be a little more, there's a difference between reliable and unreliable narrators as well. And it gets very confusing here, but a reliable narrator is someone you can trust. They're going to tell you the story and they're going to tell it to you the best of their ability, and you can believe what they're saying. An unreliable narrator has an agenda and is probably telling the story for their own benefit, which is fascinating because as you get to later parts of the story, you begin to realize, I've got to reevaluate what I saw. And that is fascinating to me. That's a little different between omniscient and covert. Omniscient narrator is just someone who may be able to bring in elements of the story that are happening in different parts of the world or different parts of the universe or different times, and is just essentially assembling it for you and telling it to you. A covert narrator is someone who's sort of hidden within the discourse. You don't even know necessarily they're narrating it or they're telling it to you until you may never know, which is a possibility, but you may be able to determine that there's something else going on. It gets a little confusing. It's difficult concepts. I'm not sure I clarified it any.
No, I think you're explaining it really. I think you're explaining it really well. I also think somebody without your training would not think that at all when watching The Return, or maybe stumble upon the idea, you know. So, and that's really great. That was one of the things that I really appreciated about the book. And mostly, you're saying that Dale Cooper is the covert narrator, but not always. Does anybody else slip into that role?
Well, I would say that anything that was, for the most part, we are seeing the story as Dale Cooper is watching it. Now, the difference here, and this really gets specific and I don't know, drive all your viewers away, but the covert narrator is actively telling us the story. The covert narrator is involved. Dale Cooper's a little bit different, I think, the way Lynch is presenting him. He's covert in that we don't see him and he's sort of hidden. But I also think what Lynch is trying to do is that we're trying to experience it as Cooper is experiencing it. So he's not necessarily skewing it for his own benefit or his own agenda, leaving parts out that he doesn't want us to know. I think he's just sort of watching it, and we are watching it as if we are him. That is subtle, and but there is a distinction there. So that's what I was trying to get at, as if Cooper's kind of watching all this transpire and we are seeing it as he sees it. So when there's something that's confusing, it's probably confusing him as well. You know, something that we see on screen that's confusing. But anyway, all that to say, I do think that Lynch found it necessary to move outside of that point of view on occasion when he was telling us the story. And he signals that to us through black and white imagery. So that things that are happening in black and white are probably not being shown to us through Cooper's filter. They're potentially more reliable. So that when Andy goes to see the firemen, Cooper's not really watching that. When we go back in time in 1956, 1945, in part 8, when we see the Trinity explosion and all those things that transpire, I don't think Cooper's aware of that. I think that that's new story material that the viewer needs to know about in order to process the larger story. So another long answer, but
interesting.
But that's what I think.
It's also funny. It's also funny to say when Andy visits the firemen. That's probably something that's really happening. Yes.
Well, I mean, that was
within the world of the story. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
It's just funny that's like the first example of, okay, maybe this is reliable now.
Well, yeah, isn't that true? Yeah, very much so. I mean, to me, it made sense as I, looked at later parts of the story that Andy is a crucial player and perhaps a substitute for what Cooper was supposed to do. And the fireman has a plan. He's sort of a larger figure who's trying to make his plan come together. And anyway, this is getting into very nitty-gritty stuff. So there are elements of the story that are outside of Cooper's perspective. And
it's fascinating. It's interesting. It's hard to manage.
Yes, without a doubt.
Yeah.
And it slipped away from me, I think. I'm the first to admit it. I tried not to force it, and say, look, I've got this theory. It's 100% right. So there were times where, even though it fit, I think 90% of the work, it doesn't always seem to work for me. And I tried to be honest about that in the book and say, I don't know what's going on here. I can't make it make sense. So rather than try to foist my opinion on you at that point, or I wanted to admit it and say, I don't really know what's happening here.
So Chapman's idea, like indirectly or otherwise, was with you as you approached the return. It wasn't like you were trying to study the return and then remembered him and then had like an aha moment. I know when you were talking with Cameron Cloutier about the like the Laura plot line and the Kalki stuff and the influence of the Vedic texts. You said you had maybe a bit of an aha moment when you were reading.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so that one was a clear-cut wow moment for you.
Yeah, I did not know how to make sense of part 8. I mean, when we see Laura essentially being, again, I'm putting my definitions around it. Somebody might read it differently. That I say the fireman is creating Laura Palmer and sending her to Earth. Well, you could, I suppose, there's many ways to interpret what's happening. What we're seeing on the screen could be something else. And I'm sure someone could write some with great theory behind it. So the Laura Palmer story was an element of the return. I think is sort of out. It's crucial to the overall story of Dale Cooper, but it's another story within the story that we have to have some sensibility about. And I didn't know when I started writing, or I shouldn't say when I started writing, when I started researching. I mean, it took months and months and months of watching it and taking notes and thinking about it and processing it and talking to people about it, which is crucial, I think, is to have discussions with other people. Trying to come to some sense of what is happening with Laura. And I did. And when I did, for me, it made sense for me. Then I was like, okay. And I wrote an essay, which ended up in the Blue Rose, and I presented it at a Twin Peaks conference last year that I felt really, really good about. I was like, yeah, this is sort of a core element. But with that essay, with that idea, you do have to find the data to back it up. You've got to do some research. You can't just say, it looks like this, and so it is. I looked into what Lynch's beliefs are. I looked into Lynch's interviews, and I found enough that supported my thesis. And so just getting back to your first question with Chapman, I didn't go into writing the book with Chapman in mind necessarily. I knew all about it. I was writing about Dale Cooper's perspective and Dale Cooper as sort of a covert character. And I realized, well, I need to make sure I include theory here. I need to research that supports this, because anyone can throw a theory out about Twin Peaks, and a lot of people do. But you do need to kind of say more about that idea than simply, I like it. You have to dig in and say, how does it work? And so that's what the theory is critical in that respect.
Yeah, I see. So you had kind of like your idea about the Laura and fireman angle, and then when you learned about the 10th avatar and Vishnu and Kalki, that solidified it. So that was the order, right? Like you kind of were thinking along those lines anyway. And then
and the log lady.
Not that this is a huge deal. It's just a curiosity that I had,
Right. Yeah. No. The pieces sort of came together. One was over here and one was over here, and then I didn't realize that they were related. So, again, I told the story. I'll make it real quick. I was fascinated with what stuff the log lady was saying to Hawk in part 10. I researched that. I saw this Hindu ideas in there. Bought a book about, Hindu theology, and was reading about it. And then that's when I saw Kalki, the 10th avatar, the white horse. I'm like, well, okay. 10 is the number of completion. It was sort of like clues that sort of fell into place. And then I felt like they coalesced, and I could assemble them into a linear argument. And that's what I did.
I see. Yeah. Yeah, cool. Brian Rourke is another person that you reference in the book. If you don't mind, I'm just going to share my screen.
Sure.
Okay, so over here on the left is a very interesting quote about Inland Empire. On the right, we have, these are quotations from your book, but they're mostly kind of things that other people might say. And both of them are dealing with the fact that Lynch's Lynch's work is tough.
Yeah.
Is tough to unpack. So can you just talk a little bit about Brian Rourke's influence?
Yeah, I didn't realize that Rourke, that stuff was out there until I was well into the book. And this happens a lot, I felt that Inland Empire was an important work because it was the last work that Lynch had done. And I just saw some stuff in Inland Empire that was happening again in The Return. And so I just looked for as many academic essays on Inland Empire as I could find, and found that one. And you don't know, sometimes, it's sort of, it's a treasure hunt in a way. You don't know if it's going to be of any use to you. There's a lot, this is what research is, I guess, right? So you read a bunch of essays, and many of them, unfortunately, don't add to your argument. They don't subtract. They're just not, they're not helpful. And then I stumbled upon some of what Rourke said, and the idea that he presents about Inland Empire is that maybe the main character in Inland Empire is entirely off screen, and that everything we're watching is essentially, he has a great way of phrasing it, and I can't remember what it is, but it's sort of the, I wish I could remember what the quote was.
It's some type of like fractured delirium or something like that.
The delirium of an off-screen character that we're seeing, the thoughts and the constant ideas that are kind of moving through the mind of someone who isn't even on screen. And I thought, well, that really supports the idea that I have about Cooper in The Return. And so obviously, if another academic writer who's done their research has discovered or is proposing an idea grounded in theory about another Lynch work, and in fact the work that came right before The Return, that is valuable. That's a valuable building block that you want to have in place. You want to quote it and say, I'm not the only one who's kind of found my way here. Someone else has about another work, and it's Lynch, so it's probable that we could apply some of this idea from one work to another, and it's very supportive of the argument I was making. Yeah. And I was really happy to find that, which is a really hard essay to read. I don't know if you've read it. It's a tough one.
Not much. I jumped around, put it that way.
Yeah,
yes,
sure.
Yeah, it's difficult, and there were parts where I wanted to. Well, there were a couple moments where I was getting a little upset, so I jumped around a little bit. But yeah, but I think there was a ton of value.
Sure.
Yeah. I thought some of it was being crammed into a certain sort of like preset framework a little bit, but the main concept that I think you borrowed from, or that you found some empathy with, that was a cool part of the essay, I think.
Yeah. It really helped me make sense a little bit of Inland Empire too, which I find fascinating. The more I've watched Inland Empire, the more I appreciate it. The first time I saw it was in the theater.
Oh, yeah.
I came out, my head was spinning. And it was a unique time in my life because I was kind of overdosed on Lynch, and we were ending Wrapped in Plastic, and I was like, I don't want to analyze this. So I left Inland Empire one watch, for years. But I knew when I was writing about The Return that I had to go back to that. I had to go back and watch it again. And luckily I liked it. I liked it even more. And I think I watched it a couple of times and like it even more every time I watch it. I knew I couldn't write about The Return without processing that film. And then obviously to process that film, I had to read what others had written about it. So
that's an interesting, I think, helpful statement. You just said, you just said obviously to process that film, I have to read around, and see what others thought about it as well. And that's just an interesting statement that I certainly believe you. I don't think everybody thinks of it that way, but yeah, that's good.
Well, I mean, that's not true for everyone. You don't have to appreciate or analyze a film. That the only way is to go read what people have written about it. But with a work that's challenging like that, you want to. And for me, an essay is something that I might not agree with. I don't think there's a lot in that Rourke essay I probably don't agree with, like you. But I wanted to open some doors. I wanted to get me thinking in a way I hadn't necessarily thought of before. And Martha Nachemson's another great example. Martha Nachemson's probably written more academic material about Lynch than any other author. And I disagree with her about a few things, but she never fails to make me think about something new.
Yeah.
And then I take that and go my own way with it. And if I can do anything for anyone, I hope at the very least, you can disagree with my whole ideas about Twin Peaks, but maybe you'll think of something I never thought of. And it'll open something up for you, which would be fantastic. That's what you want to do.
Yeah, totally. And I really appreciate that about you. I think one of the first exchanges that you and I had, I kind of put a generic question out to the internet about analysis and people's approaches. And yours was somewhat about like just keeping the ball in the air, so to speak. And you're gonna dip your oar in, and hopefully people will find some of it pleasing, of course, but also it's going to get them thinking. And then it just kind of keeps that tennis ball up in the air going. And
exactly.
I think credit to you, just in my opinion, credit to you for that point of view. Especially somebody who's really accomplished. Can I ask you a little bit about editing?
Sure. You ask me whatever you like.
I know you said that you wrote some words about every single scene in The Return.
Almost every single scene.
And once you decided to use mini essays or essays as interludes, you just had no room left in the book for a lot of those. Maybe I'm wrong, or you just didn't think the material was strong enough. Was there anything that you wrote, any scenes you wrote about that you cut that you still like?
Yes, in fact, I have thought about this. I wish I'd spent days and days. I'm serious. I mean, it took days to write about Dougie's first breakfast with Sonny Jim, where he's sitting there and he has his first cup of coffee and the music is playing and there's the owl cookie jar behind him. I went through that scene literally edit by edit. I wrote it up. I must have just been in the wrong mood when I went back to it all and I read it and I was like, this is just it's a detour. Don't waste your time on this. Keep people reading, about the larger ideas. I wish I kept it in. I like it. I've gone back and looked at it. It was pretty good. There's talk about a lot of different things that are going on in that scene. And so that's one that I cut, that I probably cut too impulsively. There are other scenes that I cut for sure that just, I could have spent time, but I realized, it was slowing things down in when you're writing about it as a book. I mean, I wrote about the autopsy of Major Briggs and the woodsman coming down the hall, and I forget what the character's name is, who comes from the Air Force, and her role in it, and
Knox.
All of that material embellishes the story. But I realized when I was presenting it in a text form that you could leave it out and no one would notice, and I felt, well, if you can leave it out and no one will notice, I better leave it out. So yes, I wrote about it, but I ended up cutting it just to keep the book moving.
I see. Yeah. So, but there are some missing pieces out there. So,
yeah, and not only about the scenes themselves, which I wrote about and just tried to streamline it. There was a lot of theory. I've said this before. It was stuff I'd written about quantum physics, and it was weighing the book down. It was just too much. So I tried to make that easier stuff to read, and so I took it out.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there are there any quantum physics sources or directions you might point somebody in who wants to
Yeah,
explore the return like through that lens? Because it's interesting. It's
yeah,
it's compelling.
yeah. I'm gonna step out of frame for two
Yeah.
seconds and grab a book. I'll
Yeah,
show
sure.
you. So this book, it's called Beyond Weird by Philip Ball. I read the whole thing, and as you can see, I don't know if you can see all the little tabs and
Yeah.
all the notes I took. This was really the core of my approach to the quantum physics ideas in the Twin Peaks: The Return. And again, as I said, so much of it left, but the idea of, you know, well, yeah, I can't remember what the specific quantum theory was, but this QBism, quantum Bayism, the idea that you can influence the effects when you're observer effect. The idea that when you're observing something, you change it, and how much you change it. And I had a bunch of that material in there, and I think Lynch is somewhat familiar, in very general sense, with some of these quantum ideas, and so I wanted to incorporate it, and ended up cutting it. But I would recommend this. This was a great book, really readable, and I would probably go back to that. Hopefully, write an essay someday about these ideas and Twin Peaks. We'll see.
Yeah, cool. Oh, so some of that cut material might surface at some point.
Yeah, maybe. I kind of hope so, but
Yeah.
I can't think about it right now.
Have you, this is a random question. Have you ever thought about like the video essay genre? Like ever like playing around with that genre?
For sure, I did, and there was a
Okay.
time before I was writing the book. I thought, well, maybe that's what I was going to do, and I'm not savvy enough to do it right now. I'm sure I could figure it out and do a good job. I did reach out to Ben Durand at Twin Peaks Unwrapped and said, "Hey, I got these ideas," and he was going to help me, but then, honestly, I'm just more comfortable writing, and that's what it was. So
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm just going to look at my list of questions for a second. Let's see. Thoughts on the legacy of the return? Any predictions? Recently, I read something you wrote a while ago, I guess in the 10-year anniversary of the original series, perhaps. And you were kind of like weighing the current and potential legacy. And I know you've written a bit about the legacy of the return, but do you have any thoughts, like a short to long term legacy? Do you feel invested in it at all? Do you feel like you have some role to play, maybe in like legacy formation or anything like that, in a way? Or I don't know. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I try not to think about that. I mean, it's a personal thing. I just wrote about it because I'm excited about it, and it appealed to me. And people have had some very generous things to say about Wrapped in Plastic, and Wrapped in Plastic being there when it was, before there was an internet, kind of keeping Twin Peaks fandom alive, which is very generous thing to say, and I hope that's true. But I can't say whether or not it is. I think that all of David Lynch's work is going to last. He's one of the great movie directors. It's just like Stanley Kubrick. There's kids in college right now who are seeing 2001: A Space Odyssey for the first time, and they're like, "Wow, this is amazing. I need to know more about this director. I need to know about this film." Some of them, it will inspire them to make films. Some of them inspire to write about film. And I think that's true of Twin Peaks and Lynch in general. And so Twin Peaks just sort of has this allure, I think, to it, because it is a longer work and it has a lot of moving parts. And I think it appeals. I think I've said this before. I think there's always going to be generations to come who will, especially when they're in college, will discover it and want to dive into it. And so in that respect, the whole work will continue to live. The return is a piece of the work. And so it can't be ignored. I mean, I guess people could just stop, with the first two seasons or whatever. But I think it will live on. I think people will continue to go back to it. The thing about The Return is it's 18 hours, and it's a big ask. It's not like Firewalk with Me, which is 2.5 hours. This is a commitment, to sit down and watch it. If you're enthused about the work, it's not. You're going to love it. But you've got to spend time with it. I think it'll be around. I think people will continually come to it and be in awe of it.
Yeah, do you think it's as amazing as I do?
Well, I wrote a whole book about it. So.
I mean, I'm not like super well read or like super like very cultured, or like I don't have a lot of film background, but I could tell, like, all right, you take what could be done, what could be experimented with in a film. You got point of view, you got setting, time, characterization, symbolism, and you could list 10 more things. And it seems like genre, and it seems like if something was there to be experimented with or played with, not just for the sake of playing, but like purposefully, it was like almost anything that could be manipulated or done. It seems like it was done in The Return, the first series too, but I think even more so in The Return. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I think a lot of that is due to Mark Frost's influence as well. Frost is a little more forensic and a little more, I guess he's interested, perhaps, he's certainly interested in the occult, but some of the science fictional aspects and trying to put pieces together and make them make sense. And certainly he knows a narrative and how to drive a narrative. So a lot of the genre elements probably came in more because of him than Lynch necessarily. But and that's the fascinating thing about the Twin Peaks throughout, with the exception perhaps of Firewalk with Me, is that you had two very, very powerfully creative individuals, but each with different sensibilities coming together. And at sometimes it's sort of like I'm going to get this, a wave is in sync with another wave. I forget what the terminology is, but when the two waves synced up, Lynch and Frost, it was brilliance beyond compare. But then when the two waves were in opposition, it was also brilliant, but for different reasons, because they were, I think, sometimes working at odds, and that opened a whole bunch of doors to interpretation. So anyway, I think there is a lot packed into the overall work, and books and books and books have been written about different parts of Twin Peaks. So I don't know how many books of essays. I'm looking at my bookshelf. And that started back in the early 90s. There were books being written about all different ways of taking the show apart. So yeah.
I love the idea of two people who are high level operators, but very different, and they probably clash on a lot of things, a lot of like life or social issues, but with the respect for each other's skill set and just respect for each other's humanity to work together. And I love that type of synthesis when it happens. I'm going to quote you, and and then I'm going to ask you if you'd like to say a bit more. So you said Twin Peaks can be revelatory, not only about what we see in it, but also about what we see in ourselves. And is there anything you'd like to say more to that? Maybe you already have, but.
Well, I mean, I kind of talked a little bit about this early on when I started studying it and didn't know a lot about.
I'm sorry, can I just add one little extra quote to that?
Of course.
Including the idea of reconstituting oneself. So
did I say that?
Yeah, okay, sorry, but that was probably some Cooper stuff. On my list of question, it follows some Red Room talk where Cooper perhaps is undergoing a long process of maybe maybe in some way putting himself back together,
or as I
reconstituting himself,
or rehabilitating himself, which is the word I use.
Do we all are we all in the red room at some point?
Oh, that's a good philosophical existential question. I think, sure. Cooper's predicament on a more metaphoric level, the idea of us struggling with our place in the world and who we are and the consequences of our actions and the goals we want to achieve. Certainly studying The Return made me think about a lot of those ideas in my own life, without a doubt. And so that's what I'm talking about in terms of revelatory, in terms of what we see in ourselves.
Yeah.
So it's that's kind of the answer is right there. I did think about, and writing the book itself, why am I writing this book? And I'm not going to make money writing this book. It's not, you don't make money writing Twin Peaks book. And then I'm like, well, do I want people to, think differently of me? And then, you realize all of that goes away. Early on, these are silly thoughts that you have in your head. But as you get further into the project, you realize I am writing this for me. I'm writing this because I want to do it. I need to do it. And I don't really worry I think Lynch has actually said stuff like this too. You do it for the doing, you don't do it for any other reason. And so the process of writing changes you a little bit, makes you think about yourself. I would say that about any art, any project that you're doing. You don't want to lose sight necessarily, or get blinded perhaps by extraneous ideas and thoughts of what the book is about, or what the painting you're doing. It's about that process of just sort of expressing yourself, and that I think is the most important thing.
Yeah, that's well said. And I know you've said a couple of times, and I think maybe also in the book, that this book was very much an act of self-expression as well, including like the publishing of it, the design of it, the involvement of family. And if you don't want to talk about family, that's fine. But it was interesting to me to see how much you credited your wife, I think, at the end. And do you want to say anything about like maybe the role she played for you?
Sure. Absolutely. Well, first of all, she helped me get the photo for the cover. So that was critically important. She held the flashlight, and it, it's a crazy story, but we went out in the middle of the night to a remote spot outside of Dallas because I knew I could get this picture, and she was there with me. But she was a huge help. Just a massive help. I honestly, there were times where, when it comes to some of the nitty-gritty technical aspects of publishing the book or formatting the book, I would get frustrated with Word, which isn't always as nimble as you want it to be for moving it into a PDF to publish on Amazon. She would come in and rescue me over and over again and figure out what I thought was just impossible. I can't get the footnotes to work, and I really wanted it to be formatted a very specific way. I wanted to have those footnotes at the bottom of the page. I wanted them to kind of be a second commentary on the work. And so anyway, she solved all those problems for me. But then more than that, she did she was one of a few people who did a copy edit on the book. And I can distinctly remember I wanted to be done. I said, I want to push, there's a button you can push and you publish it. I said, I want to go push that button. I just want to push it. And she started reading it and found some typos. And I was like, oh, and then she committed herself to reading it and found a whole bunch of mistakes that I was blind to. And so, if the book is any good, a lot of it I owe to her, without a doubt.
Yeah, that's great. I'm not too smart, but I have some expertise in grammar, and I noticed maybe like 2 typos through like 220 pages, that's like miraculous. So credit to everybody that was involved in the copy editing.
Yeah, well, that's good news, because the first book has a lot more, you'll probably notice, without a doubt. But that was a whole different situation. Yeah, well, I'm glad. That was one of the things, because I got criticism, and when I say criticism, I mean there were reviews of the first book that said, well, the typos made me laugh, and I tried to embrace that and say, yes, I know about that. Craig Miller was my editor when we were doing Rounded Blasting, and he often caught so much of those mistakes, and he wasn't around, and I did that book, and really no one else but me did that book. So any errors in there are certainly mine. So it makes me happy to know that the new book that was really important to me was to make it
good.
better in that regard. So
yeah, I mean, and then the prose, the sentences is just, that's great. And, there's no doubt about it. The guy can write. So,
I really like to hear that.
I have maybe like just two more questions, and one of them actually, is there anybody else that was in the acknowledgments section of your book that you wouldn't mind like maybe expanding on a little bit, so maybe saying a few more words beyond the acknowledgement? And by all means, just pass if you want to pass.
Wow, everybody in there was important to me. Jeff Lemire was the first person I mentioned. He is a comic book writer. He's gotten some fame with some of his work has been made into television series and stuff. And he was a fan of Wrapped in Plastic before he became Jeff Lemire. And he said some very nice things to me, some very nice things, which really, really, I said this in the book. I'm like, wow, I want to please him. He inspired me. And so he would read some of my essays before anyone else, and gave me such enthusiastic feedback. I was just like, wow, okay, maybe I can do this. But everybody, Scott Ryan was a big help. I mean, Scott's got an online personality, but people see him, it's kind of making jokes and stuff, but he gets things done. And he helped me work on that.
I was just curious. No, you did a good job in the acknowledgments. I was just curious.
Yeah.
If that guy, I think his name is Bo. Somebody like typed up the whole transcript from season 3.
Bo Monarch. Just somebody who there was. So what happened there was, these audio. I forget what they're called, what the name of these files that were sent out. I think it was during Emmy season or something, that basically had all the dialogue and continuity. And they came out, and one day he tweeted, "Hey, I turned it into the first one into a script format," which was amazing. I looked through it, was like having a script. And he did them all. He did all to 18 hours. I printed them out and I have used them. So I made sure to acknowledge him, and it's funny because I contacted him privately, and I'll just share this part. I don't think he realized, because years had passed. I don't think he knew, and he was like, "Wow, the universe does have there's karmic payoff for all that work I did," so he did a great job. That was a really neat thing that he did. I know
there's a lot of people who would love to have access to something like that, just because it's so convenient. And
and I think they're still available. There's a link somewhere. I don't. I'll see what I can find out and see if other people can. Maybe. Yeah, because.
I'm going to just ask one more thing about you that maybe you won't want to answer. Maybe. Well, like I said, I started in 2020, like in my mid-40s, which is maybe a little weird to come to this show that late, but it grabbed me and it hasn't let go. So a lot of the information that I've gathered, outside the text, podcasts and reading and whatnot, a lot of people's perspective was sort of established. Like there's some common talk. There's sort of like maybe some canonical interpretations. of the original series, and maybe less so for the return. Fire Walk with Me as well. Are there any things that you have written that you believe have kind of become like sort of part of the interpretive canon? And secondly, is there anything that you think will in the new book?
Well, I hope the Laura Palmer thing, you know, people who've read it seem to think, hey, that I didn't realize that. It makes some sense. I see this fitting, you know, clarifying elements of the return. So I hope that if anything, you know, people will at least look into some of those ideas. Maybe they'll see something else. But I mean, I wrote an essay about Cooper as a dreamer in Fire Walk with Me, and I don't know if you're familiar with that, yeah. But that was controversial at the time. I remember getting letters at Wrapped in Plastic, and people were mad. They were like literally mad.
Okay.
I would have suggested this. It's like, well, it doesn't mean it's right. I mean, it's just it made sense to me, and I really like that idea, and I think there's a lot of data to support it in the text and outside of the text. So, but I don't know if I don't think I necessarily.
Is there anything you think? Is there anything you think will not last? Like even though you love it, like it's not gonna last when people continue talking about the return. Like any takes that you had.
Oh, stuff that I've written.
Yeah, like on the return. That you think maybe you think it was cool, but you just think people are, or maybe I could say this differently. Do you have any really good critics, or anybody who's like
well, I'll tell you what,
some of your ideas pushed back, or maybe taking them in a different direction? And sorry, I keep talking, but
sure.
I think you were saying maybe to Jeremiah, maybe not, but you kind of want that, is from what I heard.
Well,
are you getting it?
I value good criticism and something more than just I don't like it. This is what I got when I wrote this Fire Walk with Me essay. Well, how dare you? Chet Jessam's a real character. It's like, okay, fine. But if you want to give me another theory, I probably would embrace other theories. I think theories can coexist.
Same.
But there was somebody who wrote a criticism. I wrote about Laura Palmer and her. It's in the first book, the realization of Laura Palmer, what Laura Palmer goes through, her trauma, and I wrote about that when I was probably 30-something years old. A white male writing about the trauma of a woman having been abused. And I read some criticism from someone who took me to task for some of the terminology I used. And I really made me think. I didn't get it. I didn't truly understand necessarily what Laura went through. I was approaching it from my very, very narrow point of view. And I value that. I've never been in contact with that critic. It was someone online. And, but whoever they are out there, they were taking me to task a little bit too. They were kind of reprimanding me. and I think perhaps rightly so. I said something like, Laura has gone through a trauma that is the worst thing that could ever happen to anyone. And this was a woman who was writing the criticism, and they said something like, why would he use terms like that? And I guess I realized, I wasn't the right person to say those things. So criticism like that is important. And I try to keep, I will say when I wrote this book, I had that some of that in mind. I realized, who am I as, a 50-year-old white male writing about some of these ideas, whether they're religious ideas or whether they're feminist ideas. or any number of other things. I want to be careful to at least acknowledge other points of view and not make blanket statements about certain things. I guess that's where I've grown somewhat as a writer. Realize that I only know what I know, and to assume that what I know is applicable to everybody else is wrong. So I tried to open my mind that way.
That's interesting. I would offer that that's got to be one of the worst things anybody can go through, and and I say that without hesitation, without apology. But well, I can't imagine anything much worse than that.
Well, I'm mischaracterizing perhaps what I said and what the person.
No,
said. I think I said. I think I said something like, "You shouldn't." It was unrecoverable, or there was no way back from this, and they took me to task for that. I apologize. I can't remember what it was, which is awful because here I am talking about it. But I would go back and look, But I said something like that, like you can't recover from what happened, and they said, well, why are you using that kind of terminology? And they were right. They were right.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, because when you have that idea of that something can't be recovered from, then the person is not only victimized by the event or by the victimizer, but then they're victimized by the fact that it happened, and I just think it's an interesting topic, because somebody can damage somebody else, and therein lies the crime, etc. in all types, moral, etc. But do they get to keep committing that crime forever? Sort of in your body's memory, in your memory, and it's
right. And I think that's what I realized, that in terms of writing, I probably just toss that off. The criticism of the content is extremely valid, and certainly something I've considered and gone back and looked at. But there was something else happening as well. It wasn't just the words I used; it was the fact that I probably wrote it pretty fast, and didn't go back and think about it a little more. I just tossed it off, and so they weren't critiquing me for that, but I'm critiquing me for that. And so in this book, I really tried to think about everything I wrote. And I'm sure there's instances where I wrote something quickly and maybe I didn't give it the full thought, but that was a valuable lesson to learn, and someone critiqued me, and I took it to heart.
Thanks for sharing that. The other critiques you get are, I'm going to share my screen again. Maybe it'll work this time. Oh my God. That's my daughter.
That's an interesting critique.
Yeah, it's like, really, tell me what you really think. Okay, so some of the critiques that you just said you get, and I could imagine, are sometimes you say some crazy sounding stuff that it's like no way, but the fun of reading your work, at least for me, is like, this is pretty out there. And then you get to the end of it, you get to the end of your sort of explanation, and it's like, okay, this is not that crazy anymore. And that's just something I happen to like. I think it's sort of impressive, but I could imagine you getting for the Dreams of Deer Meadow concept. You read the first couple paragraphs and you're like, I don't think so. And then you keep reading it and you follow the argument, and it gets you somewhere good. So anyway, that's more of maybe my interpretation of some things that you do. But here we have Lynchian, and you took a stab at it. You decided to add a little more, I think, than like the traditional sort of Lynchian thing. Do you want to say anything about this, or not really?
Well, I mean, the thing I think that having read a lot about David Lynch and his art and in interviews that he's done, and then obviously studying the return to such a depth, I really do believe that that Lynch is, and he's interested in communication so much that he is kind of asking us to participate with him in making sense of his work. That and he said this before, whatever you read into it is valid. And some people find that kind of like, well, it's sort of trite, come on, tell us what it means. And I don't think it's trite. I think he is saying, we're working on this to some level. We're working on this together, and I've left it open enough for you to come in and bring some of yourself to the work. And so if it means something to you that I never intended, and Mark Frost has said this too, so it's not just Lynch.
Yeah.
If it means something to you, or if you're seeing it in a way that I never intended or didn't think about, that's still valid. It's not like you're wrong. You can't tell someone who's experiencing art that their experience is wrong. I mean, it's just not true. It's completely valid, whatever you said. The only thing I guess I would say is, I guess what I dismiss is when someone tells you you're wrong about something, and they're there and they just sort of, they don't like your theory, and they don't attempt to at least explain why they don't like it. I mean, it's one thing that, anyway, it gets it gets
under one's skin.
Vague and obscure, but anyway.
This was a half joking question, but you want to take a stab at it?
Wow, that is crazy. I think I probably already did with you, and that is that idea that that hopefully you will think of the work. Maybe I can open a door for you that I never thought of before. Again, something that I had tweeted to you a while back, and we talked about earlier in this conversation. I don't know if that's something exclusive to me by any means. I mean, there's a lot of great critics out there who are successful, I think, because they not only get you thinking in the way that their thoughts, but they get you thinking in ways that they never intended. And so that's what I certainly want to convince or at least compel you to my ideas, want to try to support my ideas. But I also do hope that, it opens some doors that I never thought of. So cool. I don't know, stumbling through that answer for you.
Well, if anybody aside from my mom watches this, then I'll throw that question out to a wider audience too, because that might be interesting just to see how other people might respond to that.
Yeah, I will say to you, I mean, I don't know, I don't know what your perception of it is, but it's not like I have a huge reader base. It's not like there's a, teeming people who hang on every word I write, but by any means. It's Twin Peaks itself is extremely limited. And then writing about Twin Peaks is a further subset. And then unfortunately, a great many of the Twin Peaks fans dropped off because they just weren't interested in the return. And so, there's a very narrow audience there. And I was well aware of that when I was writing. Yeah.
Well, that worked out for me. So.
Good. I'm glad.
Yeah. Well, I got to thank you again, and it's really a pleasure. And,
good. Well, same here.
Yeah. I hope you enjoyed.
I did, and I enjoyed the things that you put out on Twitter. I guess I found you because you were breaking down the sentence structure of that, and I would often look at them as puzzles because I couldn't figure it out. But it was teaching me about some grammar that I'd forgotten since grade school. So, and then, obviously you're very enthused about the work. So I was drawn to your enthusiasm.
Yeah, thanks. Well, once again, I appreciate it, and I hope you have a great day. So
Yes,
yeah,
me too.
all right, we'll be in
Thanks.
touch. Cool.
All right.
All right,
Okay.
thanks, man. Take care.
You bet. Take care.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.